Bring it up to World War I, which overshadowed the invasion of Veracruz. That's one reason we don't remember it. World War I started in 1914, and oligarchs on both sides of the Atlantic wanted America involved. But what was America's interest in this war? I mean, this was a European war, right? So the incident that got us into the war was the sinking of the Lusitania. This occurred on May the 7th, 1915. At the time, Britain was at war with Germany, but we were not yet involved in the war. It was a British passenger ship on its way from New York to England, and sunk off the southern coast of Ireland by a German U-boat. 1,200 on board died, including 128 Americans. And then there was a stream of propaganda: avenge the Lusitania, take up the sword of justice, when you fire, remember this, enlist in the Navy. And new atrocity stories were invented about the Germans. For example, the public was told that the Germans were cutting the hands off children in Belgium. This was a widespread story at the time. But after the war, journalists went over to Belgium. They found there was nobody who'd ever witnessed such a thing. And do you remember during the Spanish-American War, there's a picture of the Brute? Well, guess who the Brute is now? Now the Brute has become Germany. He's the ape. He's got the Kaiser's helmet on. He's hanging onto a damsel in distress. He's got a bloody club and encourages you to enlist. And in 1915, the same year that the Lusitania sank, Hollywood released this movie, The Battle Cry of Peace, which showed an army of Huns invading America, and here they are molesting the virtuous maidens of New York City. The truth is, though, that the German fleet never even left the North Sea during the entire course of World War I. They were boxed in by the Royal Navy, which was superior. The only ships that got through the blockade were their U-boats. There was no chance or intention on their part to invade America. But why did the Germans sink the Lusitania? Well, a guy who was red-pilled on this matter was a guy I really admire, Senator Bob La Follette. He's a guy who really stood for the people. In fact, I like to call him the Ron Paul of his day. And here's what he said in a speech, quote, 4 days before the Lusitania sailed, President Wilson was warned in person by the Secretary of State Bryan that the Lusitania had 6 million rounds of ammunition on board besides explosives, and that passengers who proposed to sail on that vessel were sailing in a violation of the statute of this country, that no passengers shall travel upon a railroad train or sail upon a vessel that carries dangerous explosives, end quote. Well, the oligarchs in America were so outraged at La Follette for making this revelation, they tried to have him expelled from the U.S. Congress, and proceedings were underway for that. But then former Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan came forward and corroborated everything that La Follette said, which caused the proceedings to be called off. William Jennings Bryan, by the way, had resigned as Secretary of State because of the Wilson administration's relentless campaign to get us into the war. What was on the Lusitania that the Germans didn't want to reach England? 173 tons of Remington rifle cartridges, 50 tons of shrapnel shells, 46 tons of aluminum hydroxide, a powerful explosive used by the British military, 18 cases of mercury fulminate, another powerful military explosive, and unnumbered tons of gun cotton. I say unnumbered because the British disguised it on the manifest, but it was seen being loaded on the ship, and estimates are that it would have been over 100 tons. By the way, this is why the Lusitania went down after being hit by just one torpedo. You know, when the Lusitania was launched, it was the largest ship afloat at that time, 1906. Normally it would have taken several torpedoes, but the torpedo from the U-20, which sank the Lusitania, by the way, these World War I torpedoes were quite small compared to World War II ones. It hit the ship, and it went down in just 18 minutes. All survivors said there were two explosions, a small explosion followed by a huge one. The small explosion, of course, was the torpedo hitting, and the huge one was the munitions detonating. See, the Lusitania had been doing this on a regular basis. This wasn't the first time. It had made several trips from New York to England carrying munitions, using women and children as a protective shield. But the Germans had to stop it because they couldn't let these munitions kill their soldiers on the front in Europe. But even more damning is evidence that there was foreknowledge that the Lusitania was going to be sunk. Now, this man was our ambassador to England, Walter Hines Page. And believe it or not, while he was on public salary as our ambassador, he was also getting a private salary, a stipend, if you will, of $25,000 a year from the munitions manufacturer of Cleveland Dodge. Go figure, that's over $500,000 in today's dollars. But he wrote a letter to his son 5 days before the Lusitania was sunk, and here's what he wrote. You'll find this as an official Life and Letters. Quote, if a British liner full of American passengers be blown up, what will Uncle Sam do? That's what's going to happen. Now, a lot of you people know that Woodrow Wilson had a handler. His name was Edward Mandell House. He had no official cabinet position, but he lived right in the White House, representing Wall Street, as Mark Hanna had done with McKinley. At the time that the Lusitania went down, he was in England, of all places. And the morning that the Lusitania was sunk, he met with the British Foreign Minister, Edward Grey. And Edward Mendell House wrote, and you can find this in his official biography, he said, quote, "We spoke of the probability of an ocean liner being sunk, and I told him if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep across America, which would in itself probably carry us into the war." That same day, House and Grey traveled over to Buckingham Palace and met with King George V. And House wrote about that meeting. He said, quote, "We fell to talking, strangely enough, of the probability of Germany sinking a transatlantic liner. He," meaning the king, said, "Suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board." And about 2 hours later, the Lusitania was sunk. Now you might be wondering, how could they know where to send a passenger liner into the path of a U-boat? How could they do that? Well, for one thing, Britain had cracked Germany's naval codes, so all the radio messages from Germany to the U-boat fleet were intercepted. On top of that, they sent the Lusitania right into an area where the U-20 had sunk 2 steamers the previous day. Now, normally when the Lusitania came to England from America, destroyers would protectively accompany her. But in this case, the destroyers were held back, even though there were 4 destroyers sitting idle in the nearby port of Milford Haven. This gentleman here is Patrick Beasley, considered the greatest authority in the history of British naval intelligence, in which he was a long-term officer. And here's what he wrote in his book, Room 40. Quote, "Nothing, absolutely nothing, was done to ensure the liner's safe arrival. I am reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy deliberately to put the Lusitania at risk in the hopes that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war. Such a conspiracy could not have been put into effect without Winston Churchill's express permission and approval," end quote. Winston Churchill, by the way, the head of the British Admiralty at that time.